Hello, everyone. My name is Henry Hale. I'm a professor of political science and international affairs at George Washington University in Washington, D.C. My research focuses on political systems, political regimes, public opinion in primarily post-Soviet countries, although I have a general interest in how different countries fit into patterns that are broadly global. I would just mention that I'm the author most recently of this book, Patronal Politics, Regime Dynamics in Russia and post-Soviet countries in comparative perspective. And what I want to talk with you today about, what I was invited to talk about, is the situation regarding Putin's stability and power after Russia's invasion of Ukraine, in particular the new invasion that was launched in February of 2022. And so I want to thank the International Relations Virtual Forum at Complutense, University of Madrid, for the invitation, in particular Francisco and Carlos. And so I very much look forward to hearing your reactions, getting any questions, comments that you might care to provide. This is all very useful, as I think we're all trying to understand these events and what they might bring. So the larger point that I want to make today is that the way that the Kremlin set up the population, its own population in Russia, for the invasion, effectively means that it has to sustain a big falsehood about it and keep people believing that falsehood. And they've had some success with that among the Russian population, but this is a situation that I think does bring long-term peril for Vladimir Putin and his ability to stay in power. So, the next 20, 30 minutes, I'll try to unpack that argument for you, and then I'll look forward to hearing your reactions. So, what I want to start with is the pre-war state of public opinion in Russia. And, of course, we know that Russians have long believed that NATO, the United States, pose a threat. This goes way back before Putin, even in the 1990s. You could find majorities of Russian thinking, for example, that the economic advice provided by Western, including United States, economic advisors to Russia was intentionally designed to weaken Russia, right? So, it's no surprise that Russians have seen NATO and the United States as a threat. But I think what's less often understood is another pattern in public opinion, which has been equally consistent throughout the entire Putin period, which is that Russians want Russia to treat the West better than they think the West is actually treating Russia. So some opinion poll questions that I and my colleagues have asked in Russia for over 2 decades now have shown that if you ask Russians, how do you think the West is treating Russia, and you give them 4 options, enemy, rival, partner, or friend, the majority will say that the West is treating Russia as an enemy or a rival. But if you ask how Russia should treat the West, the majority response is actually as a partner or ally or friend. And that holds true straight up through the last major opinion poll that I was involved in organizing in Russia in December of 2021, right before the invasion. And in fact, in that December 2021 opinion poll, we asked a question that was directly on Ukraine and asked, what should Russia do in the war in Ukraine? Keeping in mind that the war in Ukraine actually started in 2014, where you've had over 13,000 people killed, even before February of this year, in clashes between the Ukrainian army and the Russian and Russian-backed rebel forces in the Donbass area. And it turns out that even though people could give multiple responses, right, they could say however many things that they would support out of these, only 8% said that they would support sending Russian armed forces to participate in combat in Ukraine on the side of rebels in the Donbass region. only 9% more said that they would support training and supplying weapons to those Ukrainians who are fighting the Kiev authorities. And so the vast majority of Russians, over 80%, were not calling for the Kremlin to invade Ukraine. At most, they were for providing moral support for Ukrainians that were fighting against the Kiev authorities, or providing humanitarian aid to the victims, or just that Russia shouldn't be involved at all. So there was no groundswell of public opinion in Russia calling for Russia to intervene militarily in any kind of direct way in Ukraine. And in fact, Putin has been perceived in the Russian population as being a foreign policy moderate, not a foreign policy radical, someone bent on revising international borders. And I think this is something that's also not commonly understood about how the Russian population sees Putin. So if we asked, and I have asked in public opinion polls several times over the years during the Putin era, what policy do you think Putin favors as for how he thinks Russia should treat the West? Majorities have also consistently answered that they think that Putin stands for treating the West as a partner or a friend of the West. And so that's a little surprising, but we have to keep in mind that this is how the Kremlin portrays Putin to its own people, through its media, through its public statements. And that is, if you look carefully at what Putin says in his speeches and how the media portray them, the media portray the West as a threat. But the way that they portray Putin is as a cool head of reason. Somebody who is a pragmatist, who really wants everybody to get along, but just wants to stand up for Russia's interests and wants to make sure that the West takes into account Russia's interests. So this is the lens through which people understand him. And so they understand him as advocating a more compromising leader than an aggressive leader trying to resolve things unilaterally on the part of Russia. And so if we look even at Kremlin rhetoric leading up to the February 24th initiation of the actual full-scale assault on Ukraine, it was largely consistent with this portrayal. That is, the media ridiculed Western intelligence statements, statements from Western leaders and analysts saying that a full-scale Russian invasion was imminent. They said that was laughable, that there was no invasion, nothing like that's going to happen. And they instead attributed this to Western hysteria and threats coming from the West primarily rather than from Russia itself. And so again, in all of this, Putin was portrayed as, well, someone who was being reasonable, right? Russia has the right to move its military in its own borders. And of course, there's going to be no invasion. How ridiculous. The West is only, just kind of getting all bent out of shape for no reason. And so, I think for all of these reasons, to me, this indicates that Putin is not in Ukraine now. I mean, his forces are not in Ukraine now as a way of boosting public support for the Kremlin in Russia. I don't think this is motivated by domestic political considerations in Russia, because there was very little evidence that the Russian population would back him in any kind of full-fledged way. And this is very different than the situation in Crimea in 2014, where you could find polls going back to the 1990s that showed that majorities of Russians thought that Crimea was actually Russian and that this was Russian land. And there were some polls indicating that Russians would even be willing to fight for it. And this is very, very different from what you find about Ukraine, where maybe at most you could find a quarter of the population thinking that Donbass should become part of Russia, but most people did not support any kind of military intervention, to be sure, as I just mentioned. So I think this whole operation started because Putin actually believed it. And I think what he also believed is that he could sell this war to the population somehow and kind of get them either to support him or at least to acquiesce. And it seems to me that so far that has proven to be accurate. But I think what this has meant, though, is that in order to stay on brand, right, to be consistent with his previous image, given the way that the Kremlin has promoted Putin's image to its own population, the Kremlin has had to convince its people of a number of major falsehoods. You could call it a big lie. And this has to be a major, heavy propaganda lift. So this begins, of course, with very heavy censorship, control over the mass media and how it reports the war and how it characterizes the war. So it's now, as is well known, illegal in Russia to call, certainly publish anything about the current events, which calls it a war. Instead, this is a special military operation. And so what's interesting about that is that even at the time when Russia was aiming at Kiev and for control over the whole country, they never characterized this as a whole full-on war. Instead, it was just a special military operation, which was an attempt, I think, to kind of keep what's happening seem to be like it's in keeping with Putin's own image, domestically cultivated image as a foreign policy moderate, rather than a aggressive kind of ultra-patriotic leader. The official media, controlled by the Kremlin, which is almost all of it now, is fully in line with this interpretation of events, the Kremlin interpretation of events. And internet, other media outlets that have promoted different interpretations, individuals who have posted things online which diverge from the official line are subject to criminal prosecution. So even though 68% of Russians say that they use the internet daily, according to the Levada Center as of March 2022, 70% of Russians still rely on television as their main source of information. And this is despite the fact that all the major television outlets are pretty much fully under control of the Kremlin. Critical media can be accessed in Russia today really only through virtual private networks or VPNs, such as, for example, the New Times with its editor Yevgeny Albats, who has chosen to stay in Russia and try and get out an opposition message to the war. But Levada Center polling in March of 2022 found that only 23% of Russia's population uses VPNs. And in fact, about half of the population didn't even know about it before being asked about it by the people doing the survey. It's different among youth, where about half of all youth, those I think it's between 18 and 26 years of age, about half of them use VPN regularly or sometimes, but this is by far not a majority of the population. So on the whole, first of all, we have to keep in mind that almost all Russians are receiving their primary information through media outlets that are almost entirely state-controlled or under some form of state restriction or censorship. And what's also important is that the way that the Kremlin has framed its war in Ukraine now is to be consistent with past Kremlin narratives about Ukraine, to try and make it make sense in terms of different kinds of almost crazy things that the Kremlin has said about Ukraine, in past years. And so one of the craziest, of course, is that Kiev has been overtaken by Nazis or Nazi forces. I mean, anyone who has spent any time in Ukraine knows that this is just, completely absurd. Not only because President Zelensky himself is Jewish and had family members, killed and otherwise victimized in the Holocaust, but just because, politics in Ukraine doesn't resemble any of the features that you could use to characterize Nazism by any reasonable definition. But the way that the Kremlin has also framed these events is, again, as I mentioned before, a military operation that is needed to restore what the Kremlin says is legitimate rule in Kiev. So basically, according to the Kremlin narrative, you get the Nazis out and you get the previous authorities back in, which presumably has in mind Viktor Yanukovych, the previous president, who was overthrown in the Euromaidan revolution in 2014. So this is the Kremlin messaging, which attempts to be consistent with its past rhetoric. And there are a couple other important features of how the Kremlin has tried to present the invasion in ways that are understandable to the public in light of what they've been told by the Kremlin before, and that would kind of help generate support, or at least not generate opposition to it. And one important point is that the Kremlin has tried to convince its population that it was immediately necessary for the Kremlin to intervene, right? The threat facing Russia from the quote-unquote Nazis in Kiev was an immediate threat. Russia's existence was at stake. And this, basically, there's a really good analysis by Paul Good, which you can find in a Ponar's Eurasia policy memo on Ponar's Eurasia. .org, another organization I'm associated with and co-direct, where he basically goes through Russian media and examines how the war was justified at different points in time. And it basically seems to me like what in the kind of American vernacular we would call throwing different pieces of spaghetti at the wall to see which pieces stick. And that is just kind of generating random justifications, regardless of how absurd, just in case some of them might resonate with the population. And these include everything from the fear that that Ukraine was about to acquire nuclear weapons, which it would use on Russia, to literally the argument that Ukraine was collaborating with the United States to generate bioweapons tailored to the Russian genome that would then be spread by migrating birds going from southeastern Ukraine to Russia to the Russian population in order to decimate the Russian population. So these are all the kinds of justifications that were used as to not only why Russia needed to do something to convince people that the negative consequences of the war were necessary. So if there are soldiers dying, they are heroes, according to the Kremlin. And if people are suffering economically, well, the argument that Putin has put forth is that the sanctions imposed by Western countries, they were coming anyway. That even if Russia had not invaded, the West still would have sanctioned Russia just to keep it down, just to keep it from growing in power. And so really, the Russian people were not losing anything, according to this narrative. And the final point I want to make about the way that the Kremlin is selling the invasion to its population is that it took great pains to try and immunize, if you might want to put it that way, the population against the flow of factual information about what was really going on. So even before you had a lot of the atrocities that were reported in places like Bucha, the Russian media was very busy telling people that, well, it is a common strategy for quote-unquote fascists to station troops and artillery right next to children's hospitals, next to schools, in order to lure Russian fire to those objects and destroy them. So it's really not the Russians' fault. It's because the Ukrainians are using children as human shields. They also were circulating reports of things like, claiming that Ukrainian secret police were approaching people who had social media accounts and threatening that if they did not claim in their social media posts that Russia was attacking, that they themselves could be prosecuted. So what this means is they're telling the Russian media are telling the Russian people that don't believe what your Ukrainian relatives and friends are telling you on social media or even in email, because they're forced to do this by Ukrainian secret police, by the Nazis. So you don't need to believe them. So this helps explain, I think, some of the these reports that you get about Ukrainians calling, or even sometimes like Russians in Ukraine, in eastern Ukraine, kind of calling or telling their relatives or their friends there, look, there are Russian shells bombing my neighborhood, and then even their own parents, or own relatives, or own friends don't believe them. They think that they're being brainwashed somehow. So I think all of this has, in fact, been successful so far for the Kremlin in rallying support for both the war itself and for Putin in Russia. And we can see this initially in opinion polls in Russia that have continued to come out. So the very first polls that came out, right, within a couple weeks of the initial shelling and the movement of tanks in late February, showed that support was actually kind of weaker than one might expect given the propaganda, but quickly public opinion seemed to consolidate around the Kremlin and around Putin, at least in the polls. So within a month, for example, support for Putin was over 80% by a number of different survey measures, including the independent Levada Center, as well as others that have more close Kremlin associations. And so this was up by about 20 percentage points from what it had been prior to the February invasion. Just to give you a taste of some of the figures and the different ways that public opinion has been measured in Russia on this. Not only support for Putin is up, trust in the Prime Minister, Mishustin, was up in June 2022 to 64%. Trust in the dominant party, which has always been less popular than Putin himself, was up to 41%, with the second place party being the Communist Party at only 11%. And the Levada Center found in this past May, that 72%, so almost 3/4 of the population, said that they wanted Putin to remain president after 2024, when his current term is up. So according to that same Levada Center poll, again, Levada Center is an independent polling agency that has generally produced decent polling results in Russia. 77% say that they support Russia's military actions in Ukraine. Again, they can't use the word invasion, but 77% support it. 73% in that poll thought that the operation was going successfully, despite the failure to basically take control of Kiev and other parts. But it's being portrayed in Russia as a success, and that's how most people see it. And finally, Levada Center asked this interesting question, which basically, I'm not literally translating it, but it's basically, do people like you bear moral responsibility for the deaths of peaceful civilians and for the destruction in Ukraine? And 58%, as of May 2022, responded absolutely not. And only 11% thought that the people of Russia bore some responsibility, or at least definitely bore responsibility for what was going on. Another 19% thought that they bore some responsibility. So one question, of course, that's often asked is, should we be treating these poll results any different now than in the past, right? Like, how can you trust any polls now in Russia, given how closed of a society it is? Are these polls just basically fake? Maybe people aren't telling the truth when they answer them. There's some indication that is partly true, but I don't think that this is wholesale the case. So for one thing, survey experts might look to the underlying patterns in the surveys. So for example, response rates, the percentage of people who respond to the poll. And these have basically remained the same over the past year, before and after the invasion. Plus, in past rallying around the flag events, right, past conflicts that Russia has been involved in, we've seen a similar pattern, right? So I already mentioned before the Crimea annexation and the invasion of Donbass and Crimea in Ukraine in 2014, and there we also saw a spike in public opinion. So it does seem to fit a normal pattern, normal in the sense of what has happened in Russia before. That said, we always have to treat polls with caution, right? Not only in the case of Russia, right? Even in the United States, other places, you have to be very careful in how you interpret the numbers that the pollsters turn up. And so, the question is, what then do these numbers actually mean? And so, my supposition has always been that the polls do indicate a good deal of sincere support for the war and for Putin, but also a significant amount of insincere support. And so one question is, how much is this the case? So there are a number of techniques that scholars can use to try and discern whether people are basically lying or dissembling when talking to pollsters. And so one of these was done if you Google London School of Economics list experiment Russia. You'll come up with one very interesting study that was conducted by some scholars at LSE. And basically the technique is very clever. It's called a list experiment. And what basically you do is you have a whole survey population that you survey, a whole sample, and you give people a list of, say, 3 things that they might do or support or believe in, right? So let's say you give them 3 things they might support. Then you ask them, how many of these do you support? And specifically you tell them, don't tell me which ones you support, only give me a number, 0, 1, 2, or 3, right? Do you support 3 of these things? Do you support 1? But then what you do is you randomly divide this sample in half, and to 1/2 you add an extra item, which might be the war or Putin, right? So the additional item that people might actually support. And so those numbers in that other group, that randomly selected group, are going to be higher than in the control group, but only because they get this extra item. And that's why this is like a list experiment. And so basically the difference between the control group that doesn't get the item of the war or Russia and the group that does get this item allows you to estimate the percentage of the population that really does support the war. Because otherwise, like if people are only giving a number and not telling you which item they support, there's no way to tell whether they really support Putin or not. So the idea is that basically you take away the risk that people face in communicating whether they support Putin or not. And according to this experiment, it found that 15% of the population was lying, basically, that 15% of the population did not actually support Putin, or did not actually support the war, but said they supported it when asked directly. But I think, unfortunately, the bottom line of this experiment was that nevertheless, 53% of Russians actually sincerely supported it, even when given a chance to hide this fact, or given the fact that they had a chance to hide any actual opposition they might have had. At the same time, I think we have to be careful that even sincere supporters of the war can be sincere in supporting it for many different reasons, and these can get very complex. Some might not have wanted this action, but then once the Kremlin did it, think that, well, I support my country right or wrong, right? That's kind of a common slogan that one hears. Or something that one hears in the United States a lot of times is like, well, we have to support the troops, right? So the idea being that, well, I didn't want the invasion of Ukraine, but these are Russian sons and daughters that are out there fighting, so we have to support them regardless. There may be some people that support parts of the war, but not others. A large number of people, I think there's good evidence, are basically kind of passive or ignorant about it. In some cases, just deferring to others, thinking, well, this is too complex. But I think there's also a good amount of what might be called just kind of willful ignorance, which basically means people don't want to know the truth, perhaps because they fear that it's kind of too awful and would face them with uncomfortable moral decisions, and so they choose basically just to disengage and not to pay attention to what's going on. And so, and then we have to take into account that these questions that ask them to support the war, ask them to support basically what the propaganda is telling them is happening. Unless they have some alternative source of information about what's really happening, maybe they wouldn't be supportive if they knew the truth. But it's hard to tell, and it's very hard to sort all these things out. But the bottom line is that this is working for the Kremlin, right? They are being successful in neutralizing opposition that might otherwise have formed, or in the best case scenario, generating support for what the Kremlin is doing. And so far, it seems that they're actually getting support. The other special pattern that I think is worth mentioning here, though, is that the support in Russia is largely of a passive variety right now, and this is interesting because I think it reflects a Kremlin strategy of not mobilization, but demobilization of the public, right? They're not calling conscription, right? They're not instituting a draft, which would mass mobilize people and get everybody involved in the conflict, right? They're not, kind of otherwise trying to get people directly involved in a war effort, to even make sacrifices for the war effort. Instead, what they're telling people is that, well, this is basically a minor operation, a minor military operation. It's succeeding. Don't worry about it. Let us take care of it. We're the professionals. That's sort of the line that they're being given. And they seem to have been having some good success in this regard. So a lot of the people that were most alarmed by and opposed to the invasion have actually left Russia, right? By some reports, as many as a couple 100,000. And so these are people leaving largely from like major cities, in particular Moscow, St. Petersburg, who might otherwise be a source of opposition in Russia. So they're kind of deactivated. And then a lot of people are just simply not paying attention for one reason or other. So that Levada Center poll that I mentioned from May found that among youth, right, and youth being like the key population that one usually looks to turn up in mass protests and rallies to try and improve their country, only 12% of people in the youngest category said that they were following the war closely, which is pretty amazing. So almost all of the youth that were responding in these surveys are kind of tuning it out. Only 22% said that they were responding, that they were following the war fairly closely, which basically means that 2/3 of Russia's youth aren't following it at all. And so I think this is another indication that the Kremlin strategy is working, and that there is currently significant support for the military operation in Russia. But the question is, and the question at the center of the talk, which I want to come back to now, is what does all this mean for what the future is likely to bring? And one finding from virtually all studies of rallying around the flag in the face of war is that this kind of rallying tends to fade. In more democratic countries, it tends to fade after a few weeks, maybe months. Putin, of course, has far more resources at his disposal, media and whatnot, to sustain a rally. But this won't last forever. And so here we're getting into kind of my, I can only offer speculation, but it's grounded in studies of rallying around the flag, public opinion dynamics, Russian politics. In the long run, what I suspect is going to happen is, and this I said, right when the war broke out, I posted some of my views on this, was that in the long run, support is going to fade in Russia. And what tends to happen is that it's not so much that people necessarily come to oppose the war, but just that a sense of general negative emotion is likely to start to emerge after the patriotic fervor goes away. And here I think it's interesting to contrast what happened in Russia with Crimea to what's happening today. Because after Russia annexed Crimea, which I mentioned before had a great deal of support in the public opinion before it happened, it resulted in euphoria in Russia. In fact, there's evidence this even led to a spike in birth rates in Russia. But that's very different what was happening from what's happening now in Russia, where the dominant moods are much more negative. So the moods that dominate Russian public opinion are those of anxiety, anger at the West, a fear of threat, at best maybe a sense of duty in the face of this, or a sense of pride in how Russia is responding to the threats, but definitely not the kind of like euphoria or positive opinion that was prominent in Crimea. And usually what happens is when these kind of negative emotions start to dominate, incumbents pay a price. And so this is the same kind of thing where, it doesn't even matter what the incumbents do or whether people even think that the incumbents are to blame for the negative mood. They tend to suffer, right? So there's studies in political science. For those of you, who study comparative politics, you'll be familiar with these, that, shark attacks are completely random, right? Mayors of seaside towns have very little control over where and when they happen. But if one happens in your community, the rating of the local mayors goes down. Conversely, when maybe the local team's football team wins a victory, the ratings of the mayor tend to go up, right? And these can be documented. These things even affect elections. Storms, random storms, things like that. And so I think there's likely to be something like that going on in Russia, where basically, the soldiers coming back in body bags in Russia, or not returning at all, right? The death, the economic problems that over the longer run are likely to emerge, are likely to take their toll and translate into a lot of this negative emotion. Plus, I think over time, certain kinds of information is going to get out in Russia, right, through all the different connections that people have. And so I think this is likely to cause big problems for the Kremlin in the time ahead. And of course, the big question is, when will this happen? Sometimes unpopular leaders can stay in power for a very long time. But what, as somebody who's studied these kinds of regimes, I notice is that the end often can be very sudden and unpredictable, triggered by almost random events. So in Tunisia in 2011, right, you had a leader who was unpopular, facing a succession crisis, and aging, right? So the succession is looming, and a random fruit vendor set himself on fire. And that sparked just this massive, unexpected uprising, which spread across a large part of the Middle East. And so, something like this, I think, is possible in Russia. And, certain points of vulnerability for Putin are that he is aging. So far, he looks to be in good health, but there are constant rumors about health problems. And I think a time period that I'm looking at carefully is 2024, which is when Putin's current presidential term expires, and which would have been his term limit, right? He would have had to leave the presidency had he not, basically orchestrated a presidential extension on term limits in 2020. And so I think what starts to happen in cases like this is, even though Russia's elections are, very controlled, they can still provide moments for opposition forces, or most importantly, figures within Putin's own circle who might be thinking ahead to a world beyond Putin, to kind of organize their own machinations with an eye to thinking about who's going to be the president next. And that can lead to a very quick and sudden collapse in presidential power. And that can usually happen long before the election itself. So, months before, maybe even a year before. So I think there are going to be a few variables that affect how likely this is and when it might happen. And first and foremost, that's how the war goes, right? If it ends as kind of a stalemate, but one in which Russia could plausibly claim to have at least liberated, quote unquote, the Donbass areas, then maybe that puts things off for a while longer. But if Russia starts to lose control even of that, or if it's the cost in casualties is even higher, we might see something like this happen even sooner. So I should probably wrap up now to leave a little time, about 15, 20 minutes or so left for discussion and questions. So let me wrap up there, and I will be happy to respond. Let's see here. Okay. Just looking through the comments. Let's see. So I have one regarding the debate, the polemic about the supposed 1 inch eastward, in the words of James Baker's promise. How has that been used to promote or portray the West as the aggressor against a victimized Russia? Well, so if I understand the question correctly, I mean, one of the key elements of how the Kremlin has justified its current actions and also justified a lot of its foreign policy in general is that you have a aggressive NATO alliance moving in on a Russia which has gotten rid of its Cold War era alliance, right? The Warsaw Pact is never part of it. In Russia, it's widely believed that there was a promise made with the unification of Germany that NATO would not expand eastward towards Russia, and certainly at least wouldn't include other former Soviet republics. This is disputed by people in NATO, right? So exactly, I'm not the historian there. I think it boils down to, in part, how different things that were said were interpreted by different people. This happens a lot. In any case, there's definitely no treaty to that effect, but it has been used in Russia as a justification for aggressive actions against NATO. And Russia points to a number of grievances to this effect, right? Not only NATO expansion, but NATO intervention in Serbia to promote the independence of Kosovo. So, in the lens through which Russia's Kremlin portrays events and through which a large majority of Russians perceive these events, you have an expanding NATO alliance whose goal is to weaken Russia, and this leaves Russia very little option but to somehow fight back. And so this is how things have been, kind of spun within Russia. Let's see if there are other questions here. Let's see, I'm not seeing any others right now. Maybe I'll wait just half a second just to see if anything else pops up. Okay, yeah. So I have a question on on China's role in the conflict. So yes, this is a very interesting and perhaps potentially pivotal at some point part of the conflict, because Putin, I think, was clearly counting on Beijing, at a minimum, doing what it's doing now in order to take the actions that it has taken. Because basically, I think Putin had started to write off the possibility of reconciling the West with its annexation of Crimea, among other things, and had started to orient its economy and foreign relations much more around China, right? Banking on the fact that Russia and China share certain commonalities, including authoritarian forms of government, resistance to efforts by the United States to exercise its influence abroad, certainly to resist efforts aimed at promoting democratization. But at the same time, I think this part of what this means is that Russia needs China a lot more than China actually needs Russia. So China basically wants to have it both ways. It wants to basically kind of have good relations with Russia, and it's very much in Chinese interest to have Russia needing China because, among other things, it can get cheaper oil, cheaper energy resources. But China also doesn't want to create some sort of much greater tensions with the United States, because it also benefits a lot from the larger international, particularly international economic order, that Russia is basically withdrawing itself from. So, my reading of China, not being a China specialist, but following its role in the conflict, is that that Beijing basically wants to have it both ways. I don't think they're going to go too far in backing Russia. They're not going to let Russia pull it down, into too much outright conflict, with Western countries. But they're going to continue to hedge their bets. And I think in the end, this benefits China considerably, because it basically, it's saying, okay, fine, all right, United States, European Union, Russia, you all battle, and they're weakening each other, and kind of who's benefiting? It's countries like China that can kind of stand on the sidelines and let things go. But again, much depends on how things develop. Let's see. So second question from Francisco is, has Putin purposefully been using Jervis's finding and perception and misperception in international politics in order to build up his narrative, or is it less sophisticated than that? I don't recall his actually citing Jervis, but absolutely, misperception plays a major role, in international conflict. And in this particular case, the Kremlin, I think, very much wants to exploit ambiguities. Right? That's what it's all about. Certainly, its justifications of what it's done have not been consistent in a lot of ways. Instead, what they try to do most of all is to create enough ambiguity that it works to its advantage. Of course, the dangers of ambiguity are that, and misperceptions are that they can sometimes lead to more conflict than is necessary, as well as more cooperation or more acquiescence. And so I think that's kind of the risk that's being, that we see at stake. I see one question now about India's role. So again, I'm far from a specialist on India, but my sense is that, kind of like China, it sort of wants to stay out of it, right? It doesn't want to be part of the sort of United States, EU-led sanctions against Russia, because this would work against its economic interests, right? It's like things. These are not great economic times for anyone coming off COVID, and instead what they have a chance to get is cheaper energy. At the same time, I don't think Modi or anyone else wants to alienate Western powers any more than they might have already been alienated. So I think it tries to straddle the fence, trying to basically just be left out to have as good relations as possible with both powers. It remains to be seen if one side or the other really tries to, put the screws on any one country, for example, by imposing secondary sanctions, which would be sanctions on countries that do business with sanctioned countries. But I really don't, I guess I just don't see that coming, because I don't think the United States or the EU really has a strong interest in putting India or other countries, other major countries anyway, in that kind of position, because I think it might be risky what choice they might make. So there's also a question about recovering historical territories of Ukraine. Um, so I think the Ukrainians are fully intent on trying to recapture everything. And I think that even includes Crimea. Realists in Ukraine, I think, agree that recapturing Crimea, kind of getting it back to Ukrainian control, is going to be much more difficult than it is to kind of reintegrate and reincorporate, win back the other parts of Ukraine that have been occupied, including the DNR and LNR. So I just don't see the Ukrainians really backing down from this, because for them, they have a strong identification with the territory of Ukraine as it was prior to February 24th. And from their perspective, to agree and even more so, especially legitimate somehow, even tacitly, Russian territorial gains coming from the heinous crimes and killings that have been conducted in the name of this war, is only going to invite more such behavior in the future, right? Because unless somehow Ukraine can find a way to develop such a strong army in a short period of time that Russia would never again dare to attack it, consolidating gains now is only, from their perspective, to just kick the can down the road, in which case they're never going to be secure because Russia will, find a way to try to take more territory next time. And so the experience of 2014 now, I think, weighs very, very heavily in Ukraine, which is that if you tacitly accept some territorial occupation now, more war and more invasion is what you're going to get in the future. And so the question then becomes, what's the military balance of power, right? How able are the Russians to hold on to this territory, and how able will the Ukrainians be with Western arms to actually dislodge the Russians from this territory? And I think these start to get into military questions that are frankly kind of beyond my competence. I would defer to military experts here. Some say that the Russians are kind of running out of their potential, whereas others say that maybe they'd be able to sustain it for longer. Whereas for Ukraine, they're getting lots of new weapons, but also have problems trying to learn how to operate these weapons. I do think the balance of resolve at the popular level is very clearly on the Ukrainian side. I think that's not often understood in the West, and certainly not understood in Russia, how fiercely determined, like the whole population of Ukraine is to, gain back these lands and establish its autonomy and full sovereignty. And that definitely includes, kind of categories of Ukrainians who speak Russian, who are also often called kind of Russian speakers, like this means they have some affinity with Russia. But nothing could be further from the truth. I mean, I think they want good relations with Russia, but their loyalties are with Ukraine. And so if it comes down to popular will, as opposed to the will of the leaderships, then Ukraine probably in the longer run has some advantage. But of course, the military balance matters too, and that's where I just don't know how things are to come out. So I need to wrap up now, and I see Francisco has posed one last question, which is, what are the main reasons to explain the ramping popularity of Zelensky, considering the poor percentages in the polls before the war? And he references the fact that, yes, I'm working on a book with my colleague Olga Onuch, which is called The Zelensky Effect, which is hopefully will come out later this year in November, on just this question. And so, what we find is that, yes, I mean, Zelensky, his ratings were rather low, in the 30% range just prior to the war. And while that actually is better than the ratings of almost all of his predecessors, if not all, at the similar stages of their presidencies. It's nothing like it is now, where you have something like 90% support. And our argument is that the different reasons why people rally around the leader in conflict are complicated, but the baseline reason is that he very successfully taps into what I was just talking about a minute ago, which is this very strong attachment of Ukrainians to the civic idea of Ukraine. That is a civic vision of Ukraine that includes all people who identify as Ukrainians within Ukraine, regardless of the language that they speak, regardless even of nationality. And so if you look, throughout his career, that's the type of Ukrainian nationalism that he has tapped into, in contradistinction to some of his political rivals. And his very life story embodies this, right? He's a son of Jewish parents who grew up in the industrial Southeast, Russian speaker, made his career primarily, in Russian. But so he kind of represents the kind of Ukrainian everyman, right? The everywoman, every person in this war. And so the fact that he's the one leading Ukraine at this moment, I think, has a special resonance for many in Ukraine. Kind of all the people now, large numbers of people in Ukraine see him as a symbol, both of Ukraine as a state, but also of this vision of Ukraine that, helps them motivate their resistance. So in any case, that's kind of to simplify a complicated story. But I want to once again say thank you so much to Francisco, Carlos, the group, and everybody attending here. Sorry I couldn't get to all the questions, but I very much look forward to kind of being in general dialogue in the future. And so let me just say thanks again, and I'll tune out here.